Hello and welcome to Second Rate Film School. I'm Andrew Wass, and today we're going to be interviewing one of the composers for Courage the Cowardly Dog, Jody Gray. Welcome to the show.
Hi, good to see you.
Well, we might as well dive right in. So, you were not involved in the original 1996 short, The Chicken from Outer Space, which introduced the world to Courage. So, how did you come to be involved in the series?
Well, it's a little circuitous. In 1996, um, John's producer at that time, Rob Marcus, who was working with John, was in his future wife was in a band that Andy Ezrin was playing in, and he said, "Okay, I'm working with this guy. He's a really, really good animator, and he's just really a wacky guy. And maybe you'd like to work with him." So Andy said, "Well, I'd have to bring Jody Gray in, because he's like, the computer maven and composer. He's done a lot of film work and blah, 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 blah. So we really want to do it together." So we did this thing with John called Noodles and Ned, which is another one of his little shows. And it was a wonderful experience as far as understanding John. John does not want anything to be in any way average. He wants to go to 120% or 1,000% with everything. He wants to go way over the top. So like we did a couple of things in this show which were sort of John Williams-esque. For instance, I'll give you an example. And then he said, "Oh, no, 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 no. Have all of those instruments played by toy instruments." So instead of trumpets, there were all these really geeky things that we did. And it was really wonderful. It worked out well. So we kind of got his sensibility, and it was very much ours. So we kind of forgot about it. And then, I don't know, whatever, 2 years later, 3 years later, John had won, or at least been nominated for the Academy Award for Chicken from Outer Space. And Andy and I got a call from Risa Newworth, who was his associate producer, and said, "Hey, we'd really like you to do this, but it's competitive." We were competing with a lot of people like Mark Mothersbaugh and all kinds of other people who were originally, slated to do it. And Mark had this huge hit with Rugrats at the time and stuff. So anyway, Andy and I said, "Well, let's do, what we do. Let's go way over the top and do something really nuts." And the first thing that we did was, that crazy little Luby, the theme for Cats. And, John went crazy and we got the gig. So then began Courage the Cowardly Dog for an incredibly long journey, about 5 or 6 years. There was some time, obviously, before it was even released in 1999. And that's how it began.
Rewatching the series has made me remember how unique and great all the music you and Andy created for the show was. It's odd, you don't really hear Courage mentioned as often as it should be when we're discussing musical scores from animated shows of this era. You tend to just mostly hear about the earlier series with Richard Stone's work like Animaniacs, Tiny Toons, Pinky and the Brain, or Shirley Walker's work with Batman the Animated Series. Now, don't get me wrong, these are all fantastic scores as well and should be admired greatly, but I think your work is also equally impressive. Like Stone and Walker's work, Courage featured a ton of original music in each episode. Yes, there were themes that would be used very often, like the main theme for the establishing shots of the farm, the bongos theme for when Courage ran, computer music, and, as you already mentioned, Cat's theme. But the amount of unique music, stings, songs, jingles, one off character or location themes on a near episode by episode scale is staggering. I'd love to see one day a soundtrack released on vinyl for this, like we saw with shows like Hey Arnold.
We're kind of working on that right now to see if we can do a 25th anniversary, like little box, like a 2 CD set with like a purple vinyl with black polka dots or something, something that's very Courage-esque. It's not a secret, but yet the ink isn't dry yet. We don't know exactly what's going to happen, but we will certainly let so let everyone. I have a list of people who have been asking for Courage music for like the last 15 years, just So I have a separate email folder of all those folks. So hopefully, and thank you very much for those accolades, because we really were encouraged by John to do something that was completely out of the box. It's very much animation music, but he wanted us to score it like it was cinema, like a show, like here's my Jalos t-shirt, like Jalos. I mean, that's like cinematic. I mean, it was like on a smaller scale, but it wasn't normally, at least for us, we didn't think of it as cartoon music at all. We just thought, like, what can we do here that's really out and weird and strange, but yet tells the story? It was really, John just kind of gave us a really long leash, and we just ran with it. And it took forever, because you're right. Every single show had original themes. There's like 5,000 pieces of music or something ridiculous in Courage.
While that is shocking, but given how much you did, also somehow not surprising. I think the real testament to your hard work here is that they're all top notch. This was not a case with like some TV shows where you poured all your main effort into the theme song and the main pieces we'd hear the most often and then slack off. No, they're all great. I mean, you'd be really hard pressed to find which ones you could cut out of a release without pissing fans off.
Volume 1 and Volume 2, of course.
Of course, look at it. We've already doubled the sales and we haven't even made them yet. Now, there are a couple pieces that I would like to highlight and get a peek behind the process for. On. Two of my favorite songs in the show which the characters interact with and create great comedic elements are Doc Gerbil's It's a Small World-like theme for the annoying ride. Secondly, in Curse of King Ramses, besides the brilliantly creepy score, we also get the supposedly ear-grating Man and Gauze song. So what was the process like on this? Did the writers have lyrics written, or was there just a note of insert small world parody here, and then you had to write it yourself?
On that one, actually, so John came in when we were scoring that, and he said, let's do like a really bizarre version of It's a Small World. So that's Andy, John, and I singing It's Doc Gerbil's World Forever on that. But we played this stupid accordion and tuba stuff over and over and over again with the same line. So that obviously it's really grating, but that's Andy, John, and I. We wrote that together in the room and just did it. The other stuff, Ramses. So Andy and I kind of sat down at 1:00 in the morning and said, what would be like the worst imaginable music that would kill us? Like, again, like really terrible 70s disco. What can we come up with? And hence, that's the King Ramses, the man in gauze, it was just ridiculous. He's no Santa Claus, it was just what we could come up with that would be really silly. And that was one of the most creative parts of that, simply because the other sort of bits of pestilence were more or less, there was the crickets, the locusts rather, and all that stuff. Those are like normal things, but that was something that we could really dig our teeth into. And it's so funny because so many people rip that off of the show and they're using it as ringtones. So like their phones are just the man in gauze. It's really funny.
Now, with that great creative streak we're seeing in these pieces, that only further highlights the unique nature of music on Courage. It's one of the few shows that you could play a theme for a character or a location, and the fans could easily know who it's for.
Totally get it, yeah.
You can pick out the theme for the Hunchback by the presence of the bells. You can pick out Ramses' theme by the Egyptian theme to it. Cat's shifty sounding music, as we've already mentioned, and basically every other villain has a pretty identifiable sound to it. The only other show that I think has that much identifiable music for its main characters, villains, or side characters is Batman the Animated Series. Fans of both shows don't even need to see the screen to know who's on it. You can tell it's the Joker's theme, you can tell it's Ramses' theme, you can tell it's the Clutching Foot's theme, LeQuack, and so on. It's a testament to the entire team with how well these themes are crafted into an episode. You look at an episode like Freaky Fred, and the image, the movement of that, freaky character are all in lockstep with the creepy music and haunting choir.
That's actually Andy and I singing doing that shit. But that's very funny that you mentioned that, because Freaky Fred was a thing that, like, I was kind of alone in the studio, and I was trying to think about what would play in this guy's head, what would be the music that he heard. So I happened to not be a fan of the Chipmunks Christmas song, Christmas, Christmas. So I did like a minor version of that for Freaky Fred. So it's really kind of the Christmas song, just like backwards, it's just messed up. And we played it. It's essentially a theme that's played in different contexts throughout the whole show. It's basically 90% of the score of the show is some version of that theme.
You know, now that you say that, I can hear that, and I'll never be able to listen to the Chipmunks Christmas again.
Sorry.
No, it's perfect. Really glad I did this interview. Joking aside, yeah, I think that choir goes a long way in helping make this genuinely creepy. Like I said, this could be used in a legit horror movie, and it wouldn't feel out of place. Imagine in an alternate world where this plays over the little jump rope girl singing 1, 2, Freddy's Coming for You and Nightmare on Elm Street, and it would fit perfectly. But instead, this was meant to be in a show for kids, which is perfect.
Yeah, that show, I am surprised that would never get on the air today, I don't think. I mean, it's just too dark and crazy. And it's like, I have a friend who's a child psychologist who called me up after seeing that show and said, "This is rape. What are you doing? This is child rape." And I'm like, "Courage is the child." And he's getting shaved, So I get it. I just think that there was a lot of really groundbreaking stuff, score-wise, that we were able to do. Pretty much everyone that you've mentioned so far were very, very unique, really interesting experiences for us, because we really thought about those themes. We didn't have a lot of time to write them, so we had to kind of, dig deep really fast and get something, because it also had to be approved by John, so we would do like a quick mock-up of it and send it, or he would come in the studio and he'd say, "This is great." Whenever we went, we know we have to do it again, so.
Now, obviously, this next question depends on if we're talking about an episode like Curse of King Ramses, where a song is intertwined into the plot, or if it's an episode where it's just score. But generally speaking, how long were you given to work, and at what point were you brought in?
I think it depends on what year it was. The first season, we had a little bit leeway, because we would get some animatics, which were essentially the early drawings, animated drawings without the color and all that stuff, and we'd get some of that stuff first so we could look at it. Later on, it became so fast that it would be like we would finish one episode and we'd have to go on to the next. It was like crazy. So I would say the beginning, since we had a little bit of lag time, kind of set the stage. So we kind of got more and more in sync with John and how he wanted to go. And John is not a musician at all, but he has a lot of music in his head and he hears stuff, but it's kind of like trying to pull the stuff out of him. What are you looking for, John? So we get the emotional content of what he was looking for, and we try to match that. So yeah, it was pretty good in the beginning. Then it got crazier and crazier. But by that time, we knew well enough. So some of that stuff took like I think the first Snowman episode, for instance, took like a day. We just did it because it had all the ice. So like it had this really cool sample of a very icy sound. So we built it in there and mixed it with Eskimo chants and drums and put it all together, and it just was so fast. Other episodes took like a week, because they were just so deep, and so they needed so much stuff. And some of the, those shows have like 30 or 40 pieces of music in them. If it wasn't dictated specifically, Like for instance, the Ride of the Valkyries, that was very specific. John wanted to do the Ride of the Valkyries, and it couldn't be like Chuck Jones, the Ride of the Valkyries. It had to be something like that was really original. So, it took a while to put all that together. You know, uh, it just really depended. I guess, I'm just thinking back as you're asking a question. It just really depended on what it was. We were able to do, some really wacky stuff fast, and later faster.
Like I said, I'm not just saying this to heap praise on you because you're my guest. I'd still say it if you weren't on, and I'd say it if we were in private. The music in this show fits perfectly, and I truly can't imagine what the show would be like without it. Now, while music is always important in a show or movie or whatever medium, I do often think back on shows or movies that I love and question, if you change the score, would it really ruin the experience? And in a lot of cases, I don't think it would impact it that much. Now, would my enjoyment of Rugrats be impacted if Mark Mothersbaugh didn't do the score? Oh, for sure, but I don't think it would be as huge of a hit to the enjoyment as if we took away your music from Courage. And I think I have anecdotal evidence which points to this. Being a scaredy cat as a kid, a lot of times if there was something scary in a movie or TV show, I would close my eyes and just listen because the scary image would be neutralized. I did that a lot with watching Judge Doom and Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and it worked. The issue, though, is with your music, I couldn't do that. It was just as scary as what was on screen. Heck, now being an adult, I am no longer scared by the images of King Ramses or Freaky Fred. But your music is still just as creepy and gets the hair on the back of my neck standing. Like, if I were ever out in the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere and I heard either of these themes, I'd crap my pants.
That's so cool. Thank you very much. I mean, that, we really went for that. I mean, so like my personal view of film and TV music is the dialogue is like the libretto for an opera. It's kind of like I like what's going on with the dialogue, what's going on with the characters, and listening to that, listening to the tone of the voice. There was great voice actors also. That wonderful guy, Peter Fernando, who's since passed away, who played a lot of characters, and Paul Sheffield, Scheffler. Sorry, Paul, who was, instrumental in so many voices, just incredible. And, I would listen to those guys' voices and the texture and the timbre of them and try to figure out also emotionally the sound of the voice and the content of the voice. What does that dictate? And that's how we kind of got this like global feel for it. And it also made it easy in a way, even though there was some music that was repeated, as it's kind of like some of the music from Demon in the Mattress was repeated. Some of the music from the Benton Tarantella piece was repeated, this sort of dark zombie music. But most of the stuff that you're talking about, I think, are these themes that just, they lay there. They didn't overwhelm the dialogue or the character. They were a part of what that all was. A lot of music is just like background music. It's just wallpaper. But we tried really hard to have something really iconic and something that drove the emotion. And that was also something that John, he just wanted the music to be awesome. And he's often said to me, I don't worry about the color. I don't worry about the music. That's it. Everything else I worry about. And that was very nice.
I think that really speaks to the quality of your work because very quickly into the show, its main character became largely mute, and large sections of the cartoon only had your music as the main thing we're hearing. Yes, of course, Eustace and Muriel talk as well as the vast majority of villains and side characters we're introduced to, but for large stretches of the show, it's behaving as if it's a silent cartoon from the 19 teens and 1920s. Now, my question to you is, what was that transition like going from being hired to score this like a regular cartoon? And what was it like trying to write around the rubber banding process from where we have background music with a bunch of people talking to the other end of the spectrum where outside the visuals, it's all we have to convey the story?
That's a good question. I think there was, as far as Courage No Longer Speaking, I think there was an issue at Cartoon Network where they didn't want him to speak anymore. They didn't, they didn't dig it. Uh, you can quote me, but I don't know if it's absolutely true, but I'm pretty sure that's where it came from. So what happened was, when there was a drop off of dialogue, or when it just became a montage, there was just more room. So we just filled it up. It wasn't like a conscious effort on our part. It was just like, oh, this needs something here. And I would say 9 out of 10 times, John liked all that stuff. And then one time he said, oh, there's too much music here. And also, one of the other things is Michael Geisler, who was the sound designer and did all the sound effects on the show. I mixed all that stuff with John. So we all sat in the room together and we made decisions as far as what was more effective. Was the music needed here, or just the sound design or sound effects, or should they be together? So it was like, if it became too cluttered, we removed stuff. So it was like, we scored the thing and that was the first pass, but the final mix of the whole thing, we put the whole show together, that was when we made those final decisions. So sometimes, like, we overdid it because we didn't know what John was going to want to take out. And he was so busy all the time. It was like, John, come on up here. And he would come at 2:00 in the morning into the studio or something. And it was like, yeah, I'm thinking back on those days of no sleep at all.
I can only imagine how exhausting that had to be at times. Also, side note, when you said that John sometimes would say there's too much music here, that reminds me of an Amadeus when the Emperor commanded him to just remove some notes.
Yeah, which notes, sire? Yeah. But this is more like clutter. Like, if something was on top of each other and it was sort of like one was felt stronger than the other, the stronger would stay. The sound design might go, In the case of one scene where we took all the sounds out, which was in Doc Gerbil, the chase scene, like, all of the sound was removed, with the exception of the dialogue. And we wrote a choir piece for that chase scene, and it's like, whoa, tons of fans have written about that forever. Like, what the hell is that all about? It's so great. Well, it was just like trying to do something different, always trying to do something different.
Like I said, your creativity in the soundtrack is unparalleled, not just in the realm of kids shows, but TV in general. Now, this leads me into my next question. Obviously, you were sometimes penned in by the theme or location or villain of the episode, which would obviously logically steer where the score would go. Arctic sounds and music for the snowman, theremin music for aliens and sci-fi stuff, Egyptian for Ramses, etc.
Yes, exactly.
Sometimes there wouldn't be a clear line of logic with what one would expect for a character or a location, though. So, for instance, when Courage has to fight a bunch of raccoons in the middle of the woods, what was the mindset there for the composing of the score?
It's a good question, really good question. So specifically, actually, the thing that you're talking about, the show with the raccoons. So there's this thing in the woods. I can't remember, camp something. I don't know. Anyway, Muriel and Eustace are out in the woods, and there are these kind of mischievous or downright evil, raccoons that are wreaking havoc on the campsite, and a campsite of terror. That's what it was called. And so it started out with this kind of beautiful morning scene where the sun's coming up and stuff. So we kind of went to the part in the very famous classical piece by Grieg, The Hall of the Mountain King, which is that theme which goes da 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 da, right? And so we started off with that, and then we kind of went off in different directions. But that was something that wasn't necessarily specific to those characters. It was more like the ambiance of the whole thing, being in the outdoors and all that kind of stuff. And we just used some really dark kind of thematic stuff, stabs or dark, weird sounding stuff, but it wasn't really thematic in the same way that something like, Jalos does, or something melodic. It wasn't necessarily melodic. So all of those things we try to put in something that would be, obvious, like there's a Nutcrackers one where he actually did this weird version of the Nutcracker suite from Tchaikovsky. We took the classical stuff, which also John was a huge fan of because he's such a giant fan of Warner Brothers cartoons, and they used to use like a lot of classical music in that. So we would take the classical music and put it on its ass. We do different things with it, use different orchestrations, and so we were always kind of like, what can we do that's different here? And if it wasn't driven by the villain, or the villain wasn't strong enough, like you had mentioned the Hunchback thing. Okay, Hunchback wasn't a villain. Hunchback was just misunderstood. And so because of Quasimodo and the Hunchback of Notre Dame and stuff, we put the bells in. We just thought, oh, that'll work. And because he was playing bells already, so sometimes it was like baked into the sequence. It was like, oh, okay, I see. This will work. And let's try this. And sometimes we tried a lot of stuff that didn't work before we landed on something that did.
Well, as an adult, I can really appreciate the full breadth of your hard work here. I know at the time you must have been reevaluating some life choices being there till 2 a.m. writing, but from a viewer experience, it was totally worth it. What's really crazy to me, though, is the usual amount of effort and fast-paced production had to get dialed up with, as both David and William mentioned, the 4th season got stretched into a 5th season to avoid a potential writer's strike.
Oh my God.
But as someone who was in the target audience at the time, I can assure you that most kids would not have noticed an extra 6-month gap. I'm sure there were other considerations outside just the audience with either like advertisers or financial filings or whatever, but at least from the perspective of a little kid, we would get excited to watch the same episode over and over and over again, even if we had seen it 15 times. It wouldn't have been that big of a deal.
Right.
So yeah, I don't want to say that your hard work wasn't appreciated or needed, but the children of America would have given you another 6-month break if needed.
It is what it is. Whatever the contracts were, whatever, it's kind of like the producer, Woody Chaffee, called us up, and I'm sure had a similar conversation with, William and David and everybody. But the call that we got was, so we're going to do 2 seasons in 6 months or whatever the hell. It was ridiculous. It was like literally doing 2 shows a week and trying to come up with original stuff all the time, and it was pretty intense.
You can actually see some of the later episodes are actually the best rated amongst the fans according to IMDb. The last episode especially is actually the highest rated of the entire show. You don't normally see a TV series literally end with its best episode, even under the best circumstances, let alone with the hand you were dealt.
That's great. I'm glad to hear that. Because the other thing is that we knew that we were onto something special while we were doing it. We really, we knew this is really great stuff, especially when we started to see, I guess the show premiered in November or October of 1999 or something like that. We really knew we had something. We didn't know it was going to become so crazy and iconic, and that there would be so many rabid fans that really loved the show, and we had no idea. And the thing is, I agree with you, because looking back, I mean, especially like the last 2 episodes, like Perfect and
Remembrance of Courage Past.
And Remembrance of Courage, which, the late Michael Sporn animated, did a beautiful job. It was lovely. It was like, wow, what a fitting ending to, the 4th season. I mean, they were just brilliant. It was the same thing in that, where we, Andy and I said, okay, this is when Courage is a little kid. So what do we do here? Okay, we will play the Courage theme on children's instruments. So we bought a little tiny piano, like literally a little tiny piano, and played the Courage theme on it. And similarly in Perfect, I played the Twinkle Twinkle Little Star Mozart, or A B C D E F G, because it was a school marm and it made sense. But each time it was played, it got darker and more kind of fucked up, and it was like So it was, they told the story, the story was there if you want to look at it. And, David and I are like brothers from another mother. We're really close. And it's kind of like we were congratulating each other, like without even really working together. We've since worked on a lot of stuff together, but that time, he was writing these scripts that were like butter. I mean, they just made so much sense, and they were so dark and crazy and, fun at the same time. So I don't, despite the fact that we were all under huge pressure, I'm glad that nobody sees that, because, I don't see it either. If I didn't have a memory of what actually went down during some of those episodes, like, I had to go to the hospital because I slipped my wrist. No, I'm kidding. But I wouldn't know. I thought they all look really good. They all sound really good. So thank you.
Well, you're welcome. Now, you mentioned playing the Courage theme on a children's piano in the last episode, and that brings up a dynamic of your work I'd like to discuss. I have a real appreciation for when any talented musicians such as you or Andy have to play crappily to get across the point of a kid or novice playing an instrument. So, what is that process like? Do you start off with a good piece of music and then experiment with how can you dumb it down, or is it something different completely?
It's really like, it's almost like I've got to get back to the same thing. Like, what does this need? Okay, this needs to be a little bit more primitive. This doesn't need to be this glorious celestial, thing going on. We're writing, Beethoven or Mozart or something. This has to be something kind of really goofy. And so we kind of did like some ham-fisted stuff. So I had a piano that had a broken block, and that meant that it was impossible to tune. And so therefore it was in the studio with us. And as the years went by during Courage, it got worse and worse, so that you can hear various, times in the show where it's just out of tune and terrible. It doesn't matter what we played on, it would still sound terrible. So that was kind of the way that the thing developed. And it was like, in the case of something like Perfect, there were times when it was beautifully played and then times when it was really crappily played. And it sort of mirrored what was going on, with the characters. And so therefore, I don't even think about it. I mean, Andy Ezrin is an incredible musician. He's incredible. He's played with everybody. He's played with Sting. He's played with Herbie. I mean, he's incredible, and right now he's off on the road with Madeline Peru. He's really good. And, he can literally play anything. But if he has to play stupid, he's totally into it. He'll play stupid, and we'll put like bad notes in, and if it's something that would be like, for instance, if it was something that needed to be deconstructed, so I would have Andy play it into the computer really beautifully, and then I would mess it up. I would take notes out. I would make notes flat or sharp. I would just make them all messed up, so he didn't have to think about it. And when he heard it back, he'd laugh. So it was whatever happened. So yeah, it's kind of like, also there are things that we would do too, where like Andy doesn't play guitar. I don't play flute. So there were episodes where he played guitar and I played flute, and it was terrible. We just didn't know we didn't know really how to make it work. So we did it and it made the structure of the score just really childlike and fun, because we were really trying, we really tried to play it, but we couldn't play it. So who cares? It was like there was a thing in that thing with the choral lights, that undersea thing, where there was a theme, and Andy and I were just playing instruments that we just hated. I played some violin. I don't play violin, just stuff like that, where it just was messed up. And I think people really love that.
As a kid, a lot of that complexity was lost on me. Add in, I was a borderline tone deaf kid whose musical experience began and ended with learning how to play a passable version of Hot Cross Buns on the trumpet in fourth grade. But now, as an adult who still hasn't surpassed that threshold, I can at least appreciate the work at play here. It wasn't just some random notes that would be considered bad. There was a real level of thought here, figuring out how to compose this so the audience know it represents something that is bad, but actually well made enough that it doesn't sound unpleasant to listen to or like a cat running across the keyboard. The only other example I could really think that did it nearly as well as you guys was in the original last episode of Futurama, where Christopher Ting had to take Fry's established poor skill as a musician, but still utilize that lack of talent to thematically make a simple but pure musical expression for his love for Leela at the end of the episode, which, like with Courage, helped create a very memorable and sweet ending to its series. So I applaud you, Andy, and Christopher Ting for being the best bad musicians out there.
I have a friend of mine, this guy Steve Belfer, who's a director and a musician. I did a lot of online Looney Tunes with him, and he did some music for SpongeBob. And he's not a great ukulele player, so he did some SpongeBob stuff that had the same kind of thing, where they would take a cue and it wouldn't be exactly kosher, it would just be a little off, but it just made the show. That stuff makes it. I really think that the whole idea of being an amateur or being primitive within the confines of what you're talking about, I think that it just brings something to it. It brings a kind of humanity to it. It's not perfect, but so what? It's good.
Exactly, and I think this off-key and non-polished nature to the music perfectly fits the aesthetic of the series. From the rickety farmhouse our characters reside in, which is more often than not depicted as having something wrong with it, to the characters themselves often performing tasks very poorly, Courage included. He may be our hero, but he generally doesn't save the day due to some brilliant plan. It's rather due to sheer willpower and brute force, usually failing multiple times before he eventually succeeds.
It's true. Yeah, it's true.
Like I said, it really aids the aesthetic of the show and its humor.
Yeah, totally. And Eustace was like the nastiest person on the face of the earth. He's like really, really nasty. And he just would never give Courage a break ever. And we played up to that, and that's another thing, some of those themes, like we had piano themes for Muriel. We had this sort of rickety fiddle theme for Eustace, and all these things play into, those characters. I'm just thinking of everything you're saying and listening in my head to that, all this stuff. Yeah. Reminding me of a lot of stuff.
Now, again, you just brought up the repeated character, location, or situational themes that we heard a ton, which were all excellent. But they were all in very different styles, and much like the show itself, the music is borderline impossible to distill down to this is what the show sounds like. You can go from goofy songs like Man and Gauze to the main theme for Ramses, and they're night and day in terms of intent and impact on the audience. Then you have very emotional themes like Last of the Star Makers, or sweet ones like The Bells for the Hunchback, that feel like they would be perfectly at home in some art house film of a man walking sadly in the rain in Paris or something, not meant to be in a cartoon with a dog that has Looney Tunes-like expressions. But the crazy thing is, it never feels like out of place or reads as, oh, the composers are really punching above the material they're in. It was perfectly utilized and felt so natural for Courage, and I think that's largely due to the unique and difficult to nail down nature of the show's musical style that allowed it to be more fluid. And that's a great example of it making sense from a character motivation. Fusili is a con man. He isn't actually a trained musician, so of course he wouldn't sound like one. And as a con man, he'll put in the exact amount of effort into any part of the con to get the work done. No more.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, and in sort of a little extension of this is, I don't know if John told you any of this stuff. He probably didn't if you only had a half an hour with him. But there's a lot of real interesting things inside the show. For instance, Linda Semensky, who was the head of Cartoon Network at the time, really was instrumental, and she's a very good friend of Jean's, was instrumental in getting the show on. And so she plays sitar. So Muriel plays sitar. And that a good deal of the music that's played when Muriel first sits down and starts playing sitar is Linda Semensky. We just had her record like a couple of lines like, tuning up, doing a couple of little licks, and we just incorporated them into the show. So it added that to it. There was a lot of times we would get some people involved, like in the show, The Great Fusilli, with that crazy crocodile, which the music is manic. So that's actually Courage playing drums. That's Marty Grabstein, who came into the studio and was hanging. And he used to be a drummer in high school. So he said, look, take a snare drum and just start banging some stuff, and we're going to put it in. So it became part of the theme for Fusilli, and it just felt very amateurish and very fun, and added just to this flavor, to have somebody who's an amateur sitar player or an amateur drummer, or there were a couple of other people that came in. I'm trying to remember now, but yeah, it was just cool because it made something really special, and they loved doing it. They were really into doing it. And I think they were so happy when they heard the final thing back, like, oh. And Marty had even forgotten about that. I was just talking to him last week because I worked on a little short movie that he worked on, and he didn't even remember. I said, dude, you're doing all these interviews, you're going to Comic-Con, you should tell people you played drums on that thing. That's like cool information. People want to know that. Anyway.
And that's a great example of it making sense from a character motivation. Fusilli is a con man. He isn't actually a trained musician, so of course he wouldn't sound like one.
Exactly.
And as a con man, he'll put in the exact amount of effort into any part of the con to get the work done. No more.
Exactly. Exactly right. That's really, really, that hits the nail on the head. I agree. It's not the most polished thing. And sometimes not the most polished thing works really well.
There's a saying in the industry that I've heard is specifically tied to sound design, but I think is applicable here as well. The better you do your job, the less people will notice the work that it took to do that job. So you put in that much effort to make the music perfectly bad, but arrange it in a way that's not actually bad, most people don't realize it's craft, but instead internalize it, which then aids with the rest of the work around it. Fusilli is a con man, and we're hearing bad music. Subconsciously, that pushes us further into the direction of believing that he's a con man. Basically, what I'm saying is, you guys should have been lazier. We would have noticed your work more.
Yeah, when we needed to do a really good job, we did a good job, really good job. Sometimes there were live players that came into the studio. Sometimes it was just Andy and I. We did a lot of stuff that was really crazy that nobody did before. Like we did this thing, it was in The Beaver's Tail and in Conway the Contaminationist, where we went in, and this friend of ours got really upset with us, but there was nothing he could do because he had already signed on. We went into the studio, and so like either Andy and I would depress the sustain pedals on the piano, and I would run my nail across the strings, and it would create this weird cacophonous sound. And we do all these weird things on the piano, and the guy's like pulling his hair out thinking we're going to smash his strings right. I would drop a tuning fork or a pencil on it or something, and we record it. It's like some John Cage classical music from the 1950s or 60s or something. But what was cool about it was, in The Beaver's Tail, it sounded like the surface of the water. It was like, you had this water that suddenly filled up nowhere. Or in Conway the Contaminationist, it was just dark, just this bouncy, polluted sounding thing. And, we did everything that we could to get out of the idea that we were doing a regular score for a cartoon, that we're doing da 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 da. We did those too. It was kind of like we did whatever we had to do. It's like, the other thing is, like, we tried to do the opposite of stuff a lot of times. Like in that particular scene, in the It's Doc Gerbils song, it was kind of like, there's a scene, a very violent scene in Stanley Kubrick's Clockwork Orange, where there's a violent rape going on, which ultimately is a murder. And the Alec character and his two boys are singing in the rain while they're killing them. And I just have always, that really affected me. I saw that when I was really little, and I thought, that is so crazy. And it's kind of like infected me, so that, I love doing the opposite also. So a lot of the stuff that when you're saying, oh yeah, that was perfect, it might have been the opposite, but it just worked. Like we would try different stuff. And that particular stuff was also really part and parcel, the experimental nature of Courage. And John would love that when we do something really crazy. He would love that. So we got away with it.
Now, something I think many people, including me, are guilty of is just distilling courage down to that scary show. But when rewatching the series for the first time in years, I realized a large amount of the episodes are very heartfelt and emotional with no real scares. Now, in fairness to our misconceptions, the majority of the episodes are scary, but I think a large amount, I'd wager about one third of them, fall into the second category, the emotional, sweet, bittersweet, nice episodes. Now, I asked John, David, and William this question from the writer and creator perspective, but this will also be applicable to you as well. Are you ever bothered that the themes that are more emotional or sweet are often overlooked, and it's mostly just the ones like Freaky Fred and The Curse of King Ramses that get all the attention?
Um, that's a really good question. One of the things that we get a lot of accolades for is The Last of the Star Makers. People love that theme, that solo piano stuff. And I would say that while the majority love the really dark, scary, ironic, weird stuff, people are always citing The Last of the Star Makers as one of the most, somebody said, it's like the most beautiful score on television. No, I don't think so. I'm not going to accept that, but thank you. But it's just really, but it's also, that stuff's baked into the what it is. And there is some dark stuff in that. Obviously the Star Maker passes away and lays eggs, and there's the army stuff in that episode, but I don't know. I guess I'll take accolades anywhere. People are really into something. But you're right. It is like two-thirds of it. Two-thirds of them are pretty scary.
This seems to be consistent with what John, David, and William have said to me when asked the same question. It seems that diehard fans will remember and recognize that one third of episodes more than just the casual fans who really haven't seen the show since they were kids, and their only real interaction with it as adults is a quick social media clip here and there that usually tend to favor the scarier episodes like Freaky Fred or Curse of King Ramses. It's never the casual fans that bring up Last of the Star Makers or Remembrance of Courage Past.
Yeah, it's the same thing with that you mentioned earlier, Hunchback. It's the same kind of thing. We get a lot of, because of that bell theme and that lovely interaction between Courage and the Hunchback in the barn and stuff, So yeah, that episode had a lot of darkness in it too. But I guess the point is, it's kind of like, I do get a lot, and now that I think about it, a lot of people do mention that stuff, maybe not as much as they mentioned Freaky Fred or Jalost or the stuff that you would think they would all, mention. But that stuff is so strange in many ways,
For me personally, my favorite themes tend to be on the more sweeter and emotional side over the scary ones. Two of the ones that are my favorites actually revolve around Eustace, the first being in The Curse of Shirley, where we see him interacting with the child version of himself, which gives so much more depth into why he's such a miserable old man.
Yeah, yeah.
And then The Mask, which is just one of the best things ever made. Specifically, it's the moment where at the end of the episode we get the small wrap-up showing Eustace and Muriel confirming their love for each other. These two moments highlight the tender side of Eustace that we really never get to see, and kind of explain why such a sweet woman like Muriel would be with a miserable old man like him.
It's true. It's true. And I'm glad you mentioned that episode too, because that's a really crazy episode and one of John's favorite, I know.
So I guess to start wrapping up, we're nearing the 25th anniversary of the series, and again, fingers crossed with that record set, because again, you already got one sale with me. So what do you think the legacy of the series should be?
I think, whether it has influenced a lot of animators and a lot of other folks, creative folks, I think that part of the legacy is that I think it has influenced some people. A lot of, up and coming people have asked me a lot of questions or done interviews about that. And I know John has had that. John has mentored some people. I think it kind of changed the landscape of humor for a little window. I don't know if something like that could be made now again, which kind of makes me sad because there's so much political correctness, in the world and stuff. Um, I think it just kind of changed. It kind of changed the language, and I think you'll see, maybe looking back and double this time in 50 years or something. I think people are going to go, "Wow, this is extraordinary." I mean, I'm so happy that it's still around, after 20 years, and that people really love it. Um, but I don't know, like, I I I think it's done some really good things as far as an iconic show. I wish I knew. It's like Crick Falusi as well. I don't know if you could go back and do this stuff. I mean, you know, what's your opinion as far as what this show has done for you personally?
I think I agree with you on that. You couldn't do a show like Courage right now, at least. Now, I don't want to be a curmudgeon and say cartoons were better in my day. Obviously, we have cycles with animation, much like anything else. You had the golden age of Disney back in the 30s and 40s. Then you would get the Looney Tune shorts a little later. Then you get to the 1950s where you get a lot of really great TV shows like the Flintstones, then later on Jetsons, Rocky and Bullwinkle, and Scooby Doo. But then we really peter out in the 1970s and most of the 80s. Now, I love a lot of those shows, but let's be honest, they don't hold a candle to what came before and what came after. Then we fast forward to the 1990s and early 2000s, where we saw a lot more creator driven shows like Courage, where accordingly, we see a massive spike in quality. Of course, nothing can last forever, and we then saw a massive dip in quality of children's programming. Now, I think we're for sure on an upswing again, but even when you look at great shows like Steven Universe or Adventure Time, which for sure pushed boundaries, I still think for every foot they pushed the boundaries on, you guys pushed a mile. Now, yes, you could say that both of these shows are able to tackle heavy subjects with less metaphorical analogies like LGBTQ+, and just have characters talk frankly about the issues compared to how it was handled in The Mask, but I think you have to remember where society was in both time periods of production, and I think Courage's handling of it was a lot more taboo, to put it mildly. Case in point, when The Mask aired in 2002, we were only 3 years removed from Ellen DeGeneres' show being canceled after she came out of the closet. So even doing a thinly veiled lesbian relationship on a kid show had to be pretty risky.
It's quite extraordinary. I mean, that was kind of like the golden years at Cartoon Network when you think of all the stuff that came out. I mean, look, there was a lot of stuff. There was Powerpuff Girls, there was Dexter, there was all kinds of stuff coming out at the same time. I was very, partial to Courage, of course, and thought that we really pushed the envelope. But that was there were very thoughtful people at the head of Cartoon Network, and they let John have an incredibly long leash, and I'm pretty sure they knew what they were getting into. John was not a quiet guy about his opinions about anything. So yeah, I think you're right. I hope that it continues to infect people, you know, um, uh, as the years go on, because I think it's definitely just so brilliant and such a wonderful show. Um, I'm not, speaking out of turn. I'm so proud to have been part of it. It was a wonderful experience, but it's just too bad because I think that there's more than anything. You're right. There are gay characters. There's a lot of other stuff going on, you know, but there's a kind of a carefulness of stuff. It's not like you said, it's not like boom. Some of the stuff is covert, but it's like covert overt. It's just like in your face, and Courage was in your face completely. And Courage was also such a lovely, lovely character. Some of the things that were so great was, when Courage sewed up the hole in the ozone layer, I mean, that kind of stuff is like, that's John. Let's do something where Courage sews up the ozone layer.
Well, I think that's the best thing I can say about Courage. There was never a bad episode. There were plenty of shows I love, but I will admit, on rewatch, you can tell when the original creative force either left, checked out, or at a certain point just ran out of ideas and were really struggling to meet the quota from the network on how many episodes they had to create. With Courage, outside the different the end cards, the amount he speaks in the early episodes, and the voice of Eustace changing.
Right.
I doubt any casual viewer could tell a season 1 episode from a season 4 episode. The show started off strong and ended just as strong. There are truly no bad episodes, and even the weaker episodes that do exist, I compare them similarly to the weaker episodes of The Twilight Zone. The worst of both of these shows is still better than the best output of a lot of other shows.
You're absolutely right. And you know that John was very influenced by the Twilight Zone, big time. He loved that writing. He loved everything about it. So yeah, cool. And the other thing is, sometimes what you say about the production teams and everything. Andy and I did the Scooby-Doo meets Courage the Cowardly Dog DVD thing. I don't know if you know about this, but and it's like we did a lot of Easter eggs and a lot of different things in it, but it's like a totally different thing. It's not Courage the Cowardly Dog. It's Scooby with Courage. The animation styles, they blended really, really well together. And I think the production guys did a really good job, but it's not the same thing. It's just not the same thing. And I hope it was successful for them. I was happy to do it. I just thought it's wonderful that Thea got a last shot, at being Muriel, because she's so wonderful. She's so wonderful. I wish everybody could have hung out with her for about 5 minutes because she was the sweetest person in the world. So I don't know. Every once in a while they talk about bringing Courage back and all that kind of stuff, but slowly but surely, stuff fades. I don't know if you can reboot that.
Yeah, it's a bit odd because Nickelodeon has rebooted a bunch of their stuff, and Warner Brothers has done Animaniacs and Tiny Toons in the past few years, and, well, Disney.
That's what they live for, yeah.
Exactly. But meanwhile, Cartoon Network hasn't done much. Powerpuff Girls and Teen Titans did have reboots. Samurai Jack I hesitate to put in the same category because that was more of a revival to finish a serialized story. But besides those three, Cartoon Network has been weirdly bucking the trends of rebooting 90s and early 2000s IPs that the others have done. Which, on the one hand, I'm glad about. Create new stuff for the new generations to be inspired by.
Absolutely.
On the other hand, as someone who grew up watching all the reruns and new versions of old Hanna-Barbera shows like the 1500 versions of Scooby-Doo, I can see the merit in bringing Courage back at least. I mean, I would really love to see what John could do with the mixed media styles we developed in the past 20 plus years.
I agree.
Well, I think that's a good note to end on. So, Jody, I just wanted to thank you for coming on today to talk about all the great music you guys created for this great show.
Thank you so much. Great doing it. Great speaking with you. Thanks.
Well, the pleasure was all mine. This has truly been a huge part of my childhood, and I loved revisiting and re-examining all the weird and quirky elements of the show. I'm sure it had no ill effect on me as a kid.
Good. Thank you so much. Really great. I'm glad you really love, you're one of those crazed people that really love this show. It's a certain sensibility, it truly is.
It 100% is. Gotta have the odd ones stick together somehow. Again, Jody, thank you for coming on, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
You too. Thanks again, man. Nice talking to you.
Now, a note from the future. The exciting thing I have to say before this episode is over that this is just part of a much larger look at Courage the Cowardly Dog. So check out the link in the description for a massive 3-part retrospective on the series featuring interviews with fellow Courage alums, including series creator John R. Dilworth, head writer David Stephen Cohen, staff writer William Hohauser, and the voice of Courage himself, Marty Grabstein, all live right now on the channel. Also live right now is the full interviews with them as well, so check those out as well. Until next time, I'm Andrew Wass, and I hope you enjoyed your time with us.